Welcome to a new series that we're doing, deep dives into companies. And today we're going to start with BlackBerry, the untold story behind the rise and fall of BlackBerry. The book's called Losing the Signal. We're joined by the co-author, Jacquie McNish. Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can also find the Kyndryl Institute app. The Kyndryl Institute has amazing thought leadership. Some of the brilliant guests we've had on the show, Rita McGrath's in there, Paul Sangeet Chowdhury's in there. His article was picked up recently by the FT, the Financial Times. You can find out more about Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute at KYNDRYL, kyndryl.com/institute. Nearly 1 billion people, a third of the world's population at the time, owned smartphones, devices that had not existed a decade earlier. Not since the advent of network television in the late 1940s had a new technology been embraced so quickly by consumers. The race for market dominance was rapid and brutish. A few industry sovereigns, Motorola and Nokia, had already toppled. Some figured RIM would be the next casualty. The latest sign was a botched launch of a Playbook tablet to compete with Apple's spectacularly successful iPad. The Playbook had a tiny fraction of the apps that made the iPad so popular, and in its rush to market, RIM had introduced the tablet without its trademark email service. Until that October day, when co-CEO Jim Balsillie touched down in his private jet in Dubai, BlackBerry was an improbable success story, the winner of one of the wildest, most disruptive technology races of the past century. For 3 days in October 2011, RIM customers were forced to go cold turkey. No BlackBerry, or Crackberry as it was called. Where did everybody go? Life seemed impossible. When the outage ended, users were as committed to mobile messaging. For Research in Motion, however, it was a different story. RIM was losing the signal to its market that it has created. That's an excerpt from today's book, Losing the Signal, The Spectacular Rise and Fall of BlackBerry. We are joined by the author of that, and some of you have seen the magnificent movie, co-author, along with Sean Silcoff, Jacquie McNish. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you, Jacquie. Absolutely love the book. So many little nuances that were skipped in the pithy stories you hear about the failure of these two brilliant business people and the really human story behind all of this disruption as well. But I'd love to start where I teed you up there when Balsillie touches down in Dubai and what happened next.
It's really quite a dramatic moment. You couldn't have invented. It's almost cinematic. You can see him sitting on his private jet. They've just landed in Dubai for a big telecommunications conference. He's loaded with special elite phones that he's going to give to the various emirs and leading business people. And he goes to his BlackBerry and he looks for that little ladder that we still have on our cellular phones, with that little ladder of lights showing you that you've got a Wi-Fi connection. And it's not there. And he's thinking, what's going on? Why don't I have a signal? Is it my phone's? Slap it around, it's not working. And as they're taxiing up to the airport, he gets the call from Mike Lazaridis, his partner who co-founded BlackBerry with him. And Mike is back in Waterloo, Ontario at their head office. And he's very grave voice. And he says, Mike, the network is down. And Jim goes, okay, the network's down. That's okay. You've got lots of networks. No, Jim, the whole network is down. And what they would discover is that they had their own private network, which was unusual for a carrier or a maker of cell phones or any technology. And that was part of Mike Lazaridis' efforts to keep it secure and to keep the messages encrypted, which made businesses very comfortable with having these networks and these phones used by their employees. And he says it's all down. And it started in Slough in Britain, where they had a giant operation of servers that routed all the messages from back and forth all over the world. And one of the servers stopped working, which is normal. So you have a backup, and then the backup wasn't working properly, and it kept trying to route the messages, and as a result, blew out the whole system. So the entire computing system was out. And within hours, the entire network around the world was gone. And for a number of days, people who were addicted to their BlackBerries had no BlackBerry, no working BlackBerry. They couldn't communicate. And there was poor Jim in an Arab convention where everyone just wanted to have the newest and best, haranguing him, when am I going to be able to use my BlackBerry? That it was so addictive, they couldn't deal with the withdrawal.
And he was there to give a keynote. I can imagine, like, many of us have given keynotes and you turn up and you're worried that the technology won't attach, maybe for your presentation, but the whole across the world was down.
It was excruciating. And Jim just basically left and went back. Well, they tried to solve it, which they did. And in the end, it wasn't their fault. The routers, which were made by someone else, weren't working. And there was a massive quiet settlement to deal with that problem.
You and I were talking before we came on air, and I was like going, damn, we need to record this. And we were talking about a few things. Firstly, I was congratulating you on the great success of the book, but also how the movie got picked up as well. And you said something beautiful. You're like, life sometimes just puts these things in your way, unforeseen events connect, and all of a sudden you have a movie. But equally, that's what happened for RIM. And these two unlikely founders, coming from very different backgrounds and actually very humble backgrounds as well. They weren't afforded the world. They weren't entitled in any way, but they really went after things. I'd love you to give us a background to these two gentlemen who made this company.
They are definitely the original odd couple in the technology field, because usually the people behind great technological inventions often have a background in some form of engineering or mathematics or science. And that certainly describes Mike Lazaridis, who had his own workbench since he was a young child, had that wonderful book, The Boy Electrician. And he would invent his own communications network that with wires going out of his bedroom to a friend down the street where they would communicate at night and during the day. So he was very much that kind of person, very interested in math. And he was at a high school where they had two classes. One was the academics, and the lower class was people who worked in the shops who were going to have working class jobs. And he was allowed to do both. And when power systems broke, he was the guy who fixed it. He had the good fortune of having teachers who understood that computers were coming. And one of his teachers, Mr. Mazinski, said, anyone who can figure out how to connect computers with mobile communications is going to be something. And that always stuck with him. So he was the boy inventor who became the founder of Research in Motion. Jim Balsillie, totally different background. He grew up in Peterborough, Ontario, which is just north of Toronto, and working class family. His father was of Métis descent, which is an Indigenous tribal group in Canada, and a time when people kept that quiet. And so he grew up feeling somewhat ashamed of his family background. He didn't particularly excel in school, lippy, scrappy kid, always getting into fights. And the seminal moment for him came in, I believe it was high school, when his math teacher was struggling at the board trying to do a complex formula. He said, where did I go wrong? This voice comes from the back of this classroom and says, you were born. He was dragged out of class, pushed against a locker and said, you are never coming in my class again. You have to go to the library and you're going to learn math yourself. The teacher assuming he was going to fail. And it was like one of those moments in his life where he had a choice. He could just give up on school, but instead he got really mad. I'm going to show him how wrong he is. And he really worked hard to study, did well in math. He took the provincial exam and actually won it. For a student from Peterborough, that's pretty unusual. And Jim got a taste of success. He got a taste of ambition, and he became a very different person. He became nerdy in his own way about school, how to study, how to, maximize the intake, and just became very successful in school. And he developed a plan where he was going to go to the best school university in Canada, which was Trinity College at University of Toronto. He went on to Harvard, and he followed a career path that if you went and worked for an accounting firm, you could then make your way up the corporate ladder. And he did join an accounting firm and learned, one, that he didn't want to be an accountant. He learned, two, in the age of electronic spreadsheets and computerized for the accounting profession, he got to know that stuff really fast. So he was at the deal table with the leading accountants doing deals, and they relied on him to tell them, how do you use these spreadsheet things? And he became quite gifted at that. And he realized that technology could change the roles. It could give him opportunities that he otherwise wouldn't have had access to.
It was interesting for me that Lazaridis, Jackie was coached me on her. Lazaridis was a reader, and so was Balsillie. So Balsillie read the seminal 1975 study of Canada's cozy business aristocracy called The Canadian Establishment, and that implanted a way for him to get to the top, and as you say, to be somebody.
Yeah.
And that was an important moment, just like the boy electrician was for Lazaridis. He also then followed the art of war as a way to behave as a businessman.
I think that you have to think of him like, it's so interesting. Like, Mike could have thought of himself as the underdog, but he never did. Mike had self-confidence, a great sense of knowledge and fascination in technology. And that's how he developed, by reading the greats, being involved in the technology and testing it. Jim always, I think, had a bit of insecurity. That kid from Peterborough certainly didn't fit in the elite levels. And at that time in Canada, business was a very small world, and it was dominated by big families, and it was pretty hard to break through. And so I think he always had a degree of insecurity about his place in the corporate world in the early days. I don't know how Sun Tzu came into his life, but Sun Tzu's book, The Art of War, became very important to him, because I think you could say he approached business from a position of, this is war. They're out to get me. For us today, that's a bit of a cliche, but for him, that was an important tool for him that helped him organize this thicket of corporate competition, elitism, and all of that. And it helped him a lot. And I think the central tenet that was most important to him was take your opponent to uneven ground. And if you look at the story of the rise of BlackBerry and the challenges, everyone was out to kill this little company to get their modems and to get the basis of the technology that led to the very addictive BlackBerry. And so he never stopped thinking of ways of outsmarting organizations, people that he viewed as threats.
We talked about both of these co-CEOs being readers, and these books having immense influences on how they thought about the world. It's one of the reasons I do the show for myself as well. It's changed my life. Reading you as an author, it's changed other people's lives. And I think that when you read a book like this and you see you can see it retrospectively, but you get an insight because you had access to Jim Balsillie, which was unusual. And if other readers, then other business people pick up that book and read it and take the time to read it mostly, they can actually avoid, or at least be aware of, so many of the biases and fallacies and foibles of just being a human, particularly when you're busy and particularly when you're successful.
That's certainly true. And we got a lot of interest all over the world from people, particularly in the technology and the consulting area. And the senior executives at Amazon, Jeff Bezos, bought a number of the books and regarded this as lessons to be learned about the risks, about the way you deal with crises or don't deal with crises, and viewed it as a learning experience. And Amazon is a good comparison because it started off as a book selling company that became, this great empire in data management and online consumer purchases. And who knows where the next new thing is going to come from that can challenge the existing technology. And that is the nature of this business, because the lifespan is not a long one unless you are constantly evolving and changing and adapting to all the new forces.
I find that such an important insight that, and again, we'll see this hopefully with the story as it unfolds, is that both CEOs became preoccupied with their success, but also fighting lawsuits, etc. And that using up of their personal bandwidth, excuse the pun, led them to miss things or to underdeliver on product quality or rush things to market as a result of just running out of time. And that's such an amazing thing with innovation. People run out of time. But let's bring it back to the spine of the story. So how Lazaridis and Balsillie overlap was Balsillie took an unusual job. He dropped out of accounting, as you said, and he went to this company, Sutherland Schultz, where the owner, Brock, gave him access because he liked him. He saw him as this kind of protege, and he was trying to grow him. But equally, then he was going to sell the company, and this left him with a dilemma.
It's an important fork in the road for Jim Balsillie, because he actually met Brock, and who was the primary owner of Sutherland Schultz in Kitchener-Waterloo area, when he was just graduating from Harvard, having finished his MBA. And at that time, most graduates wanted to go to work on Wall Street. That's where you started. You worked for one of the big firms, and then you could move from there into deal making or leadership in a corporation. So he met Rick Brock, a guy who was also from a community outside of Toronto in Ontario. And they spent a night drinking together in Boston. And through the course of the evening, Brock said, "Come work for me." And then they talked to each other on the phone the next morning. And Jim said, "Do you remember that deal you offered?" And I think that Jim decided that that's where he wanted to go. He could be a bigger fish in a smaller firm. He really liked Brock. They're friends to this day. And he thought, this would be a good start for me. I could learn how to be a manager at a company. It's a technology business, and I can really learn from this. So he did that. And it was, it surprised everyone that he knew in the school and in past encounters, because he was a made guy. I think he understood that he was not necessarily Wall Street material, and that it's important to work with someone that you respect, and he could learn about manufacturing, and that was fate for him.
We mentioned the art of war thing, which just comes up time and time again, but he also treated everybody not so pleasantly by the looks of things, or when you read between the lines. And when Rick Brock went to sell his company, he was trying to give him a lifeline to maybe lead a different organization. And that organization, the VCs or whoever was buying it, was like going, "Yeah, this is a deal, except we don't want Balsillie."
And it's a very dramatic moment in the story, because Brock and Jim, Brock was the primary owner of the company, so he made the deal. They were the Dutch company, and they were driving to a hunting camp in Ontario for a break. And he had one of those early car phones where you could just turn it on so that you could hear the voice over the speaker on the car system. And the Dutch people said, "The deal is done. We're going to go ahead, but we're not going to take Jim. We don't want him." And Jim was sitting in the car next to him. And that was a very devastating moment for Jim, in one that was difficult for him to understand, because in his mind, he was doing everything he could to help this company grow. And Jim, in his heart at that time, was still that scrappy kid. Do it to them before they do it to you. That was his way of surviving in the corporate world. And he didn't have a lot of friends in the company. And for the Dutch, they viewed him as a disruptive force in the negative sense. Whereas Jim would tell you, in technology, you have to be disruptive. But that was a very hard moment for Jim. And as a result, he needed to find something else to do. So yes, a small division was going to be spun off. He was going to be overseeing that. And he knew Mike at that point, because they were selling some sort of radio-based systems for keeping track of how the manufacturing was working, the shipments, all of that. And he went to go visit Mike in his very small, cramped office above a bagel store in Kitchener-Waterloo. And it looked like a frat house when he walked in there and started to talk about Mike about buying the business. And it was a bit of a process before that happened.
Lazaridis then, for his part, he gets his route into wireless data through carriers and this thing called the Mobitext network. And I thought this was interesting to bring it back to the point of life throws you lemons and what do you do with them. And he was working for this company, essentially assembling a network. And then that company pulled out and he was left with these assets, this capability. And it was about how he would use that capability. And this was really the origin, from my reading of it, actually, where actually we can do something with this ourselves. Maybe we'll pick up the story from there.
When Mike started his company with his childhood friend, Doug Fragan, he was very much focused on the concept of combining mobile communications with computing. He and Doug tried early iterations where cash register could communicate with other technologies. And it was small stuff that wasn't important at that time. Nobody was lining up to buy it. He did work in manufacturing that helped them keep track of what was being completed, packaged, and going at different areas. But it was never a big success. So he really kept his mind focused on modems because he knew that was going to be the technology that allowed mobile communications to happen. So they were working very hard on it. And if you went into Mike's office and above the bagel store in Kitchener back then, he would have thought you'd taken a wrong turn and ended up in a frat house because it was a bunch of guys on desks that were made out of doors with wires connected everywhere, desks in the bathroom. It was a very humble setting for a bunch of very creative guys trying to figure this out. When Jim learned from Mike what he had and that they were close to creating these modems that were working and would allow for that kind of sort of digital communications, he became very interested. At the time, Mike Lazaridis was pretty much out of money and it looked like they weren't going to succeed. They had a big contract with a US company that was going to buy a lot of modems, but they did the Darwinian thing, which is that they canceled the order, which left them having spent all this money, that they needed the money. And so Jim mortgaged his house to develop this partnership with Mike, and the money was gone like the next day because they had so many bills to pay. And I taught Jim that lesson, which is these bigger guys are just cutthroat. They're out to get you. And so Jim was exactly what Mike needed at that point. In fact, at one point before Mike hired him, said, "You've got to meet my wife, Ophelia." And they had dinner together and Jim went his way and Ophelia and Mike left together. And she said, "He's a shark." And Mike said, "He's going to be my shark." And he recognized that he needed that.
So then they're in bed together after Ophelia's warning and they struggle. They struggle for a long time. So this is a chapter you nicely call After the Bee Gees Staying Alive. So it lurches through near misses. There's constant cash pressure and rough economics of hardware and carrier dependency. And one of the things that really came to mind here reading this was how political the landscape was here and how that Sun Tzu's Art of War was probably right in many ways, that it was very cutthroat and there was a lot of deals that were just used, and including this happened to this team where they were given a massive contract in order to just use up all their bandwidth.
Not only that, but to leave them hanging, having spent all that money, all the money that Mike had on this technology, they were left high and dry. And the company that was supposed to buy it made it very clear that they were very interested in the patent behind this. And Mike and Jim were of the view that they tried to bankrupt them to get patent. I don't know if that's true or not, but you can see that it was unusual behavior to have made this contract and then cancel it. It was a tough business environment. So Jim, people will say in hindsight, he was sneaky, he was difficult, he was unpredictable. But That's how Jim kept the company alive. And Mike wasn't that kind of a shark, right? He wanted to be in the lab inventing. And Jim had to be very wily to outsmart these much bigger threatening companies.
It's also interesting when you read the book to see how other successful companies were managing and actually the seeds of their own downfall. Motorola, for example, opened a new market with a Tango, a pager, and Nokia had this thing, the 9000 communicator. And as you say, it was a book-sized tool that looked like a cell phone strapped to a mini keyboard. But you could see the origins of these new devices. And then there was the great nemesis of RIM eventually, which was both nemesis of US Robotics, who were the company who led RIM then, the garden path. But this was also Palm. And Palm was an interesting player and an important part in the whole story.
Yeah. Palm at the time was run by Carl Yankowski. He was the CEO, very charismatic guy who, if you sat down and talked to him, would tell you how he'd won several gold medals at the Olympics, had the world's most expensive cars and jets. Even he was a real character, very different from Mike and Jim. And at the time, Palm was really hot because they had created a mobile device that could connect you with your computer and you would have access to your calendar. And you could do some data communications with your calendar on your handheld device to adjust it. And you also had a list of your contacts. So that was, today it seems like nothing, but that was a really big step back in those days. And they looked at BlackBerry and they saw that we could do this as well. We could bring emails to the Palm. And Mike and Jim saw him for what he was, which was just a big, brash and braggart that was trying to charm them, thinking that he could outcharm these small timers from Kitchener Waterloo. But they were very sharp, and at the time, they were really connected. Mike and Jim could almost read each other's minds, and they settled on this. They were not going to sell anything to him. They were going to go along with it, but they started playing this game with him because Jim said, I was on the Olympic hockey team of Canada, which was a lie. Carl would say, oh, me too. I won 9 gold medals. It's just one-upmanship. And they led him along and he thought that he had them and then they dumped him. So they just left him. So it's a fun moment. It's not the kind of way a lot of people would want to run business, but they felt they were left with no choice. And all they had was the ability to outsmart the predators. And that was a very good example, humorous, of how they were able to keep Palm at bay.
Another couple of players we should probably mention in the story are RAM Mobile, RAM, and Bell South. And this eventually led to this moment where, a game-changing moment in the entire story, where Lazaridis had written this basically roadmap for the future of mobile messaging called Success Lies in Paradox. Maybe you'll fill in the gaps of how we get here.
The paradox in success, as I understand it, was based on the notion that less is more. Because a lot of the big technology companies were trying to do a lot with mobile communications. You could have your calendars, you could have your email, you could have a whole bunch of things. And he felt that simplicity was important. And this is a really important element in the success of BlackBerry in the early days. Networks in those days were very primitive. The Mobitex network, created by Ericsson, was one of the few working data communication systems. It's one of the few ways you could get data across the wires so that you could communicate. And Mike, you could call a conservative engineer. And that perspective, that sense of the limits of the networks is, I think, what led to the success of BlackBerry. If you think of what was happening before then, Apple, IBM, Palm, all these people that tried create mobile communicators wanted to cram big things into it, but the networks couldn't support it. Apple famously had the Newton, the early device where you could write on it and it would send a message. across the wires, which led to the famous Doonesbury cartoon of a guy receiving a message saying egg freckles, because the systems couldn't handle these guys cramming what they thought their products should be on the networks. Mike was a conservationist. He understood the limits, and less is more in two ways. One, it was going to be a very simple device, and it went through several iterations, but it ended up being very small, a small keyboard that you could operate with your thumbs. It was, I don't know if you remember getting your first emails on a BlackBerry, but you would get to from subject line and maybe one sentence, and there'd be a little word more auto. And you would click that, and that was a message to the network to send more data to you. And nobody else figured that out. And I think this is an important factor in the early success of BlackBerry, was he understood the limits of the system. And he worked with that and made it work. And eventually the carriers started to enhance their mobile networks so that you could do more. But that is, to me, one of the most important elements that Mike understood that made it work for them.
I'm glad you called that out, because I felt in a way that you see with so many brilliant innovators that once they create a way that works, they create path dependency, mental path dependency. This is how it works. Then the environment changes, or some other technology, like we're seeing today with AI, but like some other technology, like the carriers change. The ability to send bigger packets of data changes. And this is why I'm fast forwarding a bit here. This is why they just couldn't get their head around the iPhone when it came around, because Jobs had done a deal with the carrier, Singular in particular in the US, to be the sole provider of the iPhone. But when Lazaridis looked at it, he couldn't understand, how are they doing this? And how are they allowed to do this by the carrier?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that is the most important juncture for BlackBerry, because they had all the success. They were selling like crazy. There was no end in sight to demand for their product. Steve Jobs had two things going for him. One, he had a huge audience of fans. When the first iPhone came out, it was called the Jesus phone. And that was because of the enormous following that he had for his technology. So he had an embedded audience that was open to this. And secondly, you're absolutely right. He changed the game because he did a $4 billion deal with Singular that made it worth their while to invest in the networks, to increase the capacity to do what Steve Jobs wanted to do. Mike Wright, when he watched Steve Jobs speak at this conference in San Francisco, he said that's an impossibility, because he was talking about videos, photos, maps, all these things that you could not then possibly do on the networks. It would have crashed the system. And it was a battle BlackBerry always faced. It kept adding thousands and hundreds of thousands of new customers every day behind the backs of the carriers, and their systems were crashing because even the simple use of the BlackBerry, too many users, was crashing their system. What they didn't understand is that big multi-billion-dollar deal created the basis for new, stronger, more robust networks that could do what Steve Jobs wanted with the iPhone. And if you lived in New York when the first iPhone came out, you were really mad at Apple because the system was crashing all the time. AT&T couldn't keep up with the demand, but it eventually got there.
I think that's such an important aspect in it all, in that, because you show that with companies like Nokia as well. They tried to do this, and it was almost like they had created this mental block. It's like that saying, oh, we tried that already. Well, you try that already, and then the environment, the business environment changes, or some surrounding technology changes that enables you to go, we tried that already, but the world's changed. And that was a huge blocker just for everybody. But to rewind now back, we're back in 1997, it's October, and Balsillie had parlayed Bell South's commitment to buy this phone, the Bullfrog, which came after the Leapfrog, and this instilled the idea of an IPO. And they tried to do this on Toronto Stock Exchange. It wasn't that interesting really at the time, because it wasn't usually what was there. There wasn't tech in Canada really at the time. But what was interesting there was that RIM realized they had to also change the game, like you said, with that more button, that they actually had to have technology behind to build an ecosystem, and everybody else was just playing in their lane. And that was a game changer for RIM.
I think that Mike and Jim together agreed on a system that was quite unique. And that was that BlackBerry was going to build its own network. It was going to have the servers. It was going to own or have control of the servers that sent their messages. All their messages would be encrypted because they understood from the beginning that the market for their BlackBerries, their early BlackBerries, were going to be people, business people, particularly salespeople, people who had to leave the office and hated getting on their laptops or whatever at the end of the day and having to go through 50, 60 emails. And that was their market. And in order to get that business, because very few IT managers in those days were comfortable letting anyone outside the company manage their communications. So they had to prove that they could provide security, and that was through their network operating facilities in Slough, in London, in Toronto, in the United States, all over the world, where as their audience grew, they were secure, they were safe. And so that gave them an enormous advantage in selling these to the corporate world and lots of security. And in addition to this, they made a lot of money. And this was Jim Balsillie's idea, which was they would charge a service fee to the users to get money. And on good years, we're talking billions of dollars that would come from this. So it was, I think, originally done to get the business, but it became a very successful model and very unique because no one else was ever really able to do it, and it no longer exists.
So this was this central relay hub, and
yes,
also encrypted, which was a really important thing. But I just wanted to mention one thing that, again, you wouldn't think of unless you're working in a startup, perhaps. But the pressure that Lazaridis put on his team, in particular, you'd mentioned this guy, Musso, and it came to mind the other day, Jackie, my son asked me, he said, do elephants sleep standing up? And I was like, that's a great question. So I looked it up, and it's actually, they do both. So they sleep standing up if they feel they're not fully protected, if they feel in any way threatened, or say if they're in a zoo or whatever, they'll sleep lying down. And it reminded me of this guy, Musso, because you mentioned that he fell asleep at the computer one day with his eyes open. He was working so hard.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of camaraderie in the Kitchener-Waterloo head office, particularly the tech sector. He was one of the many characters that populated RIM in the early days, and they worked really hard. It was like a frat house. They played lots of games with each other. My favorite anecdote of that time was they were always inventing something that was silly, right, to relieve the pressure of what they had to do. And one day they'd invented this little wireless operated tank truck that they would send down the hallways, having fun to see how far it would go. And one day it headed down the hallway, and Mike and Jim were at the end of a hallway with Mike's office on one side and Jim's on the other side. And it rolled down the hallway and turned towards Jim's office, they were all afraid of Jim. They were, oh crap, he's going to go to Jim's office. But at the last moment, it turns around. It goes to Mike Lazaridis' office, which is my way of saying there was a lot of fun in those early days as well, but a healthy understanding of never wanting to be on the wrong side of Jim Balsillie.
And we'll come back to actually how that culture changed as the company, like every company as it scales, has to grow up at one stage.
Yeah.
And he brings a new team. But there was a really interesting piece, I thought, which again, a lot of our audience will have experienced, where the engineers inside a company see the world very differently. And they wanted to call this device the Pocket Link, but the branding company wanted to call it something totally different. And this is where we end up with it being called a BlackBerry. I thought that was an interesting little anecdote in the story, because it just shows you how there's a big difference between the marketer type CEO, like a Jobs, and the engineer type, like a Wozniak or a Lazaridis.
Yeah, the There were lots of name suggestions. They ultimately went to a marketing firm, I believe, in California, which gave them a variety of choices. And the firm actually came up with the idea of BlackBerry. Mike and his team were thinking pocket link. A bunch of nerdy guys. It made total sense to them. You could link it through your pocket to the network. But BlackBerry was like this unique, interesting idea. And if you looked at the early keyboard of a BlackBerry, they'd look like a bit like the buttons you might see on a BlackBerry. But Jim and his crew wanted to call it Blade. And they just like a lot of testosterone on the sales team, manly toy instrument for people. And the marketing guy gave Mike Lazaridis a call and said, tell Jim to look up www.blade.com. And that they were all in the same office as those Black. All Mike heard after he'd sent that email out was a lot of, oh, that's nasty. And in fact, it was a porn site.
Wouldn't have been great for SEO.
That didn't work out as a need.
Brilliant. But the real breakthrough then, I thought this was really interesting, just the psychology of this was that if you thought about who bought phones inside large organizations, if not phones, pagers back then, maybe palms, maybe computers, it was a CIO, and maybe is still the case in many organizations, and they'll do a big deal. But BlackBerry had a very clever idea of getting it in the hands of people at the top and make it become top-down, pushed by top-down senior management rather than IT. And that was a game changer because then it just infiltrated the business world.
Jim had created a team of young, aspiring, mostly men, salespeople who went to conferences, who went to gatherings, and showed them what they could do while they were away from the office. And they particularly targeted salespeople and senior executives. And it was like a light went off in their heads because you mean I can do my emails from long distance? And they sold it as a status symbol. If you had a BlackBerry, you were a made person. I remember as a reporter interviewing people who had early like CEOs and other people who had a BlackBerry. While I was interviewing them, you could see them. The table like, what is that? The BlackBerry. You walk away and you would say, why don't I not have a BlackBerry? And then that's how they sold it. It became such a status symbol for the business person. And if you didn't have one, your boss was going to be haranguing you as to why you hadn't responded to the email or why you hadn't done what he told you to do. And it became a pretty easy sell.
So at this stage, it's an interesting product. And as you told me before we came on air, then everybody starts to come after you. They come after your lunch. Loads of players started to try things. And it's really interesting to see the backstories of these other companies where, for example, Motorola had the head start here, but they had overinvested in Iridium and had this, again, used up all the company's bandwidth. I just find that so interesting that a company can invest in an area and just back the wrong horse. And by backing that wrong horse, you can just use up all your revenue in your company versus actually back several horses and hope one might come through. But it makes BlackBerry at this stage have to run into iterations of iterations as its user base is shooting up, and it's barely able to keep up with the demand. And at this stage, we have the competitors, but also the company has to grow up, and they have to hire in some new people, and those new people weren't very welcome because they were now asking these kind of scrappy engineers in the frat room to grow up.
Yeah, you've touched on something I think that is very important. It was a very heady time. The world was being reinvented. The way we communicated was being reinvented. And nobody knew where it was going to go. Nobody knew that BlackBerry would be the success that it was, that mobile devices was going to be the big moneymaker. Motorola invested in Iridium, the satellite system, because as a company, it thought it was a brilliant strategy because they were going to compete with the handheld devices. They were going to create this network of satellites around the planet that people needed to communicate, but they were expensive. They spent too much money on it and the demand wasn't there. So a lot of people were betting in the wrong places at that time. And RIM bet in the right place. It sold it to the right audience, and it had a brilliant networking system, thanks to Mike Lazaridis, and a really strong sales team, thanks to Jim. And it worked out for them. And a lot of other people, it didn't work out because they picked the wrong place.
And interestingly, there was an interview with Steve Jobs once, and he said, Apple, at the time he was talking, he said, we're a small company, so we have to bet on technologies that are in their spring, that are just about to take off. I thought about that. And the time when he wasn't CEO, it was John Scully at the time, was the time of the Newton. And they just bet on the technology too early, probably. And I just think that's such a piece that people miss with all this, is that there's so much luck with everything. And we can be so damning on ourselves sometimes that it doesn't work out. And you're going, there's so many pieces of the pie, sliding doors that need to land for us to do this. But a couple of interesting parts of the success story here was, you were talking about the fact that they didn't even have a proper billing system to track sales. And there was a guy, RIM's controller, Harvey Taylor, he complained to the sales vice president, Don McMurtry, that hundreds of customers weren't paying monthly service charges. And he wasn't prepared for McMurtry's response, which was, losing a few hundred to get tens of thousands of orders is an acceptable cost. And then they had to bring in some new blood. And this new blood then wanted people to map out product release dates, et cetera, and it wasn't very welcomed inside the organization.
It was a very undisciplined company because it was just responding to what needed to be done. And it needed to be that flexible. It needed to be chaotic because they didn't want rules and barriers. They wanted to just get out. Jim deployed this amazing network of sales staff who were very flexible. At one point, the sales staff found themselves in an unair conditioned warehouse, I believe it was in New Jersey, where they had to go in and modulate the network system because there was a flaw. So think about a salesman in a Fortune 500 company that would do something like that. They wouldn't. These guys did. They all wore multiple hats. There was a real camaraderie, team spirit, do what you have to do to succeed. And that worked for a long time until it had to grow up.
There's a part that here, I just pulled a little excerpt from the book. You said Balsillie and Lazaridis knew they were not well suited to running their own service for billing. We were just barely holding stuff together, said Balsillie at the time. RIM lacked the staff and experience to manage the billing and service needs of a booming customer base. But while it made sense to hand back office administration over to Balsillie, Balsillie wasn't going to yield everything. So he fought like crazy to get $10, and Bell South eventually capitulated, handing Balsillie the clout he needed to wrestle similar fees from other carriers eager to sell BlackBerries. Artists followed, as did Canada's Rogers and Bell, which ran similar data networks. This was when things started to just take off. As you said, new revenue streams started to come in that they hadn't imagined.
Yeah. No, it was a very few. I don't think they made that exception for anyone else, but for Research in Motion, because at that point they really needed to have the BlackBerry because the demand was so strong. And that was Jim, and that was Jim's idea. He saw an opportunity to charge, and at the top of when it peaked, it was hundreds of millions of dollars of extra income for them. That was quite extraordinary. And most people following the company didn't really understand that.
This character as well, I think I remember him from the movie, this guy, Larry Connolly. So he was hired in from Motorola as one of the two new chief operating officers to bring order to the chaotic growth. And it was along with this guy, Don Morrison, and there was good cop, bad cop here. And the bad cop, again, like I say, was just not welcome because he was trying to get people to have discipline about expansion, commit to plans, accountability in the organization where there was none.
Larry Connolly, he was a very thoughtful man. He was a very large, imposing figure physically. And he understood that his job was to be the enforcer because it was a freewheeling, spirited company that was chaotic. And if you are having to hire hundreds of people a week, you need systems, you need discipline. Larry was greatly resented by the younger engineers who had been there from the beginning. And they felt that he was taking away the magic. He was taking away the creative spirit, the ennui that had made BlackBerry possible. But Larry and Jim understood that company could no longer exist if it was going to survive. It was becoming rapidly a big corporation that needed more controls, more discipline, because you can't be hiring dozens of people a week, taking them by bus to a big conference center in Waterloo to introduce them to people and to give them something to do without having a plan. And there was no plan in those days. People were just hired and they had to make up what their job was. It was crazy. So I could understand why the engineers who had been there from the beginning greatly disliked Larry, blamed him for destroying the culture. But I don't think that's a fair perspective. He needed to enforce a new discipline, a new ethos, a new corporate culture. And it was hard and it was tough. And he was willing to take the blows. And to this day, Jim Balsillie greatly admired what he did and was thankful for what he did.
There's a very good book called From Barbarians to Bureaucrats by a guy called Lawrence Miller. And he talks about the life cycle of an organization that starts off like a barbarian type organization, but eventually gets taken over by bureaucrats. But not in a negative sense. It's like you need them to put manners on the company, but you need to keep that kind of barbaric spirit, the entrepreneurial spirit inside in the organization.
It's a balancing act. And his biggest beef with the company was that they would say, okay, we're going to introduce a new BlackBerry next year, but it never came. And it might be months late, sometimes a year late. And he understood that you couldn't do that. You were not going to survive as an entity if you didn't deliver what you said you. So that was the huge challenge that he faced. He sped things up. They didn't always meet their commitment dates, but he sped that up. And that was important because new entrants were coming in and they were going to be vulnerable if they didn't deliver on what they were promising.
I'm sure this is something that many VCs who invest in startups experience. You said when Connolly requested a report on the company's strategic objectives, all he got was a forecast on the next quarter's sales and expenses. And he was told there was no P&L projections for the next year, no budgets for the company's divisions. And all that was happening was Lazaridis and Balsillie signed off on spending. And then you talked about this designer, this radio software designer, Matthias Vondel inside the organization. He vented in his private journal about the meeting where Connolly said, guys, we need to put deadlines here that are realistic. And he wrote that the whole idea was probably to change RIM's culture to be something more along the line of a stable company like Motorola, instead of the wild and unstable entrepreneurial company that we were. This could alienate people that helped create the company. RIM could no longer rely on star performers. Instead, the company would rely on procedures and policies to get things done. Many engineers, Vondel wrote, were asking the same question: how could Mike let him do this? So in a way, they saw this as a betrayal that Lazaridis let in this guy, and now this guy was stamping on the culture, and Mike had his back, and this annoyed these original hires inside the company.
What that tells you is that how little they understood the corporate world. These guys were brilliant. What they created was amazing. It was ridiculous that they had succeeded in doing it, but they did, and they never gave up. And under Mike's guidance, they did amazing things. But the company needed more than that. And I've heard from a lot of them, they blamed Jim, they blamed Connolly and the corporate senior people that came in for the failure of the company. And that's their perspective. They're allowed to have it. But if you stand back and look at it, that's not why they failed. They didn't fail because they were more organized, they were more disciplined and more accountable, but failed because they made the wrong bet. It just didn't work out for them. Eventually, someone smarter came along and made a better version, and that was Apple.
I have to hold myself back here from going down the rabbit hole of so many different directions. But eventually, we know RIM becomes this massive success. Lots of people chasing after it. Tries to do deals with RIM, their new technology. They launched BlackBerry Connect. We're going to skip all that because one of the things that is often missed that happened here was the tragedy of 9/11 and how it changed how BlackBerry was considered in the States, and then particularly by Washington because of the encryption. And this was a game changer.
9/11 was a tragedy in so many ways, and the scale of it was beyond the capacity for most people to comprehend. And the most urgent need in those early minutes, hours of the collapse of the World Trade Center was, where are people? Who survived? Who didn't? And AT&T got overwhelmed. As I understand it, they only had 1 or 2 base stations in Manhattan, whereas BlackBerry had several, and their network was working in a way that AT&T's wasn't. And Wall Street was where people used BlackBerries. People relied on them. It was the primary business communications tool at that time, and it allowed people to connect with people that were still using their BlackBerries. It allowed people who were stranded on planes, in airports, or whatever, to communicate to their families when there was so much uncertainty about who had been affected. And it was a very important moment in the eye of this horrific event for BlackBerry.
They called them crypto berries because they were so secure, and now the government could use them. But then a real moment happened, you mentioned, where it was Thanksgiving, and Oprah has this famous moment where she used to launch her favorite product and she gave everyone a BlackBerry, and again, sales went through the roof in North America.
That was a really seminal moment. Oprah, she was the guru of shopping. She backed something you were made. I don't know if you've seen the video. The video is extraordinary. She just went over the top. She just, I love it. It's changed my life. And the crowd is roaring, and she's giving a free one to everyone in the audience. They went to the moon after that.
I'm going to top off the rise with this small little paragraph. In 14 short years, Lazaridis and Balsillie had steered RIM from the obscurity of a small Ontario city to claim the title as the new kings of technology with an inventive smartphone that was a must-have status symbol for professionals. And RIM's financial condition was catching up with their aspirations. By its 2006 fiscal year, the company's revenue exceeded $2 billion, a milestone that would be passed with the release of a new BlackBerry smartphone. This, Lazaridis said, was a very different BlackBerry. Delivering music and home videos, RIM was also talking to customers in a very different way. For years, it has relied on carriers to market its own products to their customers. Now, RIM was starting its own branding campaign aimed for the first time at consumers. Computer World columnist Mike Elgin declared the slim phone as groundbreaking, genre-killing, and trend-setting device. So it sounds like an iPhone later on, but that was the peak. But the fall comes, and the fall started really with this patent fight with NTP, and let's take it up from there.
Yeah, this is definitely the sad part of the story, because what happens is a series of cascading crises, threats that are just hard to imagine. They came almost as fast as BlackBerry's success. Now, the patent dispute goes back to how the network operated. Nobody took it seriously. And frankly, BlackBerry was arrogant about it, which did not play well with the court involved, the patent court involved in overseeing this. In retrospect, we could say they should have settled that right away, or maybe tens of millions of dollars. But they ended up having to pay a fortune at the end when the judge basically said, you're shutting down the network. I order you to shut down the network because you are not respecting this court. You are not paying what is due to the now deceased creator of this patent. So you had that. You had the backdating of stock options scandal. It was just one calamity after another. And the final blow was when they introduced the phone, the Storm, the unfortunately named Storm, that did not perform, did not meet the standards that people had come to expect. It was basically unusable, and most of them were returned. So it was just devastating, one after another, these events.
One of the things we were saying before we came on air was I was telling you how I felt some of the practices that Balsillie engaged in, like they're very common. Like it's like that Gordon Gekko greed is good kind of Wall Street type approach to business that a lot of people were trained in, and that's how you get ahead. And unfortunately, seems to work. A lot of narcissists running companies are out there. But he did a few things. One was, for example, where they launched BlackBerry Connect. They led many competitors like Nokia, for example, down the garden path where they thought they were building a co-product together. And they just wasted 2 years. And in one particular case you mentioned in the book, this executive lost his job because of it. And he knew, he actually had this sneaking suspicion that BlackBerry were not really playing ball with him. But the other was the really funny story of the Palm guy again, and he got his comeuppance.
Yeah, so Carl Yankowski, who was the CEO of Palm, I think really wanted to buy them out and realized he couldn't. And then he wanted to understand their technology. They wanted to know what carrier network that they would be using. And Mike and Jim just wanted to confuse, misdirect him, get rid of him because they didn't want to do any deals with him. And they actually created a phone that showed who the carrier was. And I think it was on the left-hand side, you could tell who the signal was from. And they showed him the phone. And they had created this, they had put the imprint of this carrier on that wasn't actually the carrier that they were going to use. And they said, well, we can't tell you, but we can show you the phone. And Yankowski, according to Jim Balsillie, saw the carrier's name on this fake phone and started pursuing them, but it didn't work out. But this is what they felt they had to do to deceive, to ward off, to stay above water, with so many people trying to come at them, to buy them, to outcompete them, to destroy them. It was, we can look at it and say, oh, that's unethical, or we can look at it and say, that's how they survived.
Exactly. And unfortunately, it came back to roost in some ways with the amount of energy that it drained for them. You mentioned this in the book as well, The Art of War. Sun Tzu talks about this moment of being on the death ground, where things are really bad. And Balsillie actually admitted that's how he felt going through the courts at the time, particularly about the patent courts. And then later on about the securities where they were backdating stock valuations. And maybe we'll say a bit about that because there was a huge mental toll. And I was saying to you before we came on air, when you see somebody at the top of an organization who has worked so hard to get there, apart from the amount of personal energy that goes into that, the amount of sacrifice. At one stage you were saying there was a couple of RIM engineers, including Lazaridis, working on Christmas Day. And Lazaridis went up and got them a takeaway from a burger joint. And that just shows you the amount of effort people put in to earn these big dollars. But there's a massive cost to that.
I think the most significant factor at this point, as the competition is rising, is the pressure of growth are becoming overwhelming. And the number of predators that are out there trying to buy, steal, undermine, outcompete was putting enormous pressure on the company. And it was putting a lot of pressure on this remarkable partnership between Jim and Mike, two very different people, the shark and the innovator, who had worked so well together, but separately. There was Jim's world. And one of the elements of the BlackBerry story is that there was no big head office. There were multiple buildings throughout Kitchener-Waterloo where their company was based. So you could go, for weeks without seeing each other because they had their own teams. And it worked really well until things started to go really wrong. And the first one was the patent fight. And Mike took that on because he was the guy that understood patents. He was the guy that understood technology. He could articulate why they hadn't stolen this patent. But Mike is a fragile person in the limelight. And when he's under fire in an area he doesn't understand, such as law, patent law, who does understand patent law? It's a very narrow, talented area of skill. And Mike wasn't up to it. And Mike actually came home. He couldn't keep going. And he suffered enormously as a result of that, because he was not able to explain it in a way that the court was understanding. He had difficulty responding to the aggressive questions by the other side. And so he asked Jim to step in. And Jim took the bullet and became the public face of this crisis. And a lot of people were saying, just settle. But it was very difficult. And it was a crisis. It ended up being a crisis for Jim. He ended up in a hotel room having close to a breakdown. Very difficult time. And Jim told us all about this. He was comfortable talking about that crisis and how he had lost confidence in himself, confidence in his ability to save this company because of the enormous threat that they were facing. It reached the point where the judge said, I'm shutting you guys down, basically, unless you reach a settlement. And he didn't know which way to turn. And he ended up bringing in this guru who helped bring him back to a place where he had confidence in himself and the ability to go forward. And I don't think Jim ever forgave Mike for that he was put in that position. And their other big crisis was the backdating of stock options, which was a practice in Silicon Valley where they would lower the price of the options that they'd given you so that you could profit more when you were in a position to sell those options on the stocks. And Mike felt that Jim had betrayed him by allowing this to happen. Jim felt this was the only way that I was able to attract talent from Silicon Valley, from the United States, that we needed to keep the company going. And these controversies to the outsider just looked like bad decisions. What we didn't understand until it was all over is that this drove enormous wedges between the two leaders. They no longer spoke to each other. Very difficult time for the company, and it trickled down and things started to weaken. Direction became more feeble, and it became a very difficult time for the company.
That's what's so interesting and so important, I think, to share is those things that actually happen. Like, we're all human here. So these are humans and those decisions are made. Because when we tend to talk about these stories, you see them as, oh, the idiots, or they deserve this or whatever. You're going, no one deserves that. And I think that you do a great job of telling those stories and also with the access that you had. But I just wanted to mention about the iPhone piece, because they did know it's different. And you call this out in the book that, of course, when we read these headlines that you're dismissive of this new technology, that you can actually see it as, oh, they're idiots. They didn't see it coming. But of course they did. And you mentioned this moment where Steve Jobs steps on the stage, announced that the iPhone. Mike was actually on a treadmill at home watching it. And the next day he pulls Jim into his office and Jim says, it's okay, we'll be fine. And Mike says, no, this is different. These guys are really good. And then RIM's chiefs didn't give much additional thought to Apple for months because, for example, some of the comments you say, Larry Connolly, who we mentioned earlier on, he said, it wasn't a threat to our core business. It wasn't secure. It had rapid battery drain and a lousy digital keyboard. If the iPhone gained traction, RIM senior executives believed it would be with consumers who cared more about YouTube and other internet escapes than efficiency and security. And one of the reasons I call that out is, I'm sure you've seen this time and time again, is that's what you would say because you're so busy. And this is where you call it. They were so busy with so many deals. They were hiring people at such a rate that they could barely keep up with it. They were selling at such a rate they could barely keep up with it. That when a threat like this raises its head, you go, oh, that's dangerous, but we have to deliver all this stuff. And that challenge inside any organization is so deep.
It is. And you have highlighted all of the key moments in RIM when they watched Steve Jobs walk on stage and said, quoting Wayne Gretzky, famous Canadian hockey player, I skate to where the puck is going. And it's a very shrewd remark and use of a quote by Steve Jobs. because he knew that this is where the world was going. I understand why Mike would have said this is an impossibility. He's looking at this conference, the video of this conference in San Francisco, and they're talking about maps and movies and photos, all of the things that they couldn't do at BlackBerry because the carriers wouldn't let them, because they didn't want load on the network. That kind of data, most networks were not built to carry that. They did not have the capacity. But the most important announcement that Steve Jobs made that day was not the phone. It was his deal with Singular, which would become part of AT&T. And they were going to invest billions of dollars in a new network. The big enemy within BlackBerry was the carriers, because they wouldn't let them even add more customers because they were concerned about the networks crashing as a result of it. So their battle always was with the networks. And Jobs brilliantly saw that if he could get an ally that was going to invest an enormous amount of money in more capacity, he could make this work. And if you had an early BlackBerry, in those days in New York in particular, your phone was dropping stuff all the time. You were cut off all the time. But after a year, they got it sorted.
So we're landing the ship here with the fall, but later on there's a chapter called Goat Rodeo. And this is where QNX becomes part of the plan to rebuild the future, even as the present keeps deteriorating. As you said, and we're skipping a couple of chapters here, the relationship with the carriers became more and more challenged. They released the Storm phone that you mentioned earlier on. It wasn't very good. They'd fast-tracked it. They knew there was lots of problems with it. We talked about Apple's problem with autocorrect. The Storm was terrible. It didn't even click. Stephen Fry, the comedian and actor and writer, absolutely slams it on Twitter. So things were going really bad. And then this QNX part becomes a plan to get us out of all of this.
Well, QNX is interesting because they were at the time based, I think, in Ottawa, Ontario. Absolutely brilliant technology. And in fact, QNX now is the guts of what the new BlackBerry is. Their systems are being used, their technology, which is obviously advanced since they acquired it, is being used for the operating systems that they're selling to cars, to the automakers, because it was a really good technology, but it didn't quite fit with what they wanted to do with the phone. So Mike saw the future and saw how brilliant these guys were, but they couldn't integrate it right away with the phone to give it an edge against Apple, and that didn't work. But the asset in the long run was a great asset to have purchased.
So again, pieces are falling away here as they're going on, and now they're leaning on their security aspect of it. This is as Arab Spring unfolds and their encrypted messaging becomes really important, and there's a whole geopolitical pressure on the company at this stage.
Everyone wants them to give them access. The Arab Spring, they wanted to have the network opened. It's this trickle effect of one crisis after another. And that became overwhelming. All of these crises were very serious and very devastating. And I do believe that the company could have done a better job of navigating, could have done a better job of inventing. But there was something that they couldn't fix, and that was the breakdown between Mike Lazaridis and Jim Balsillie. It was over stock options. It was over the patent lawsuit. They lost faith in each other. They didn't trust each other, and they felt betrayed. And that to me is the essential tragedy of the BlackBerry story. These two very different people, completely, whether in personalities or talent levels, made that work for them to create, to sell, to grow BlackBerry, is what made them weak when things started to go bad. And another element is the board of directors. We're talking about two co-CEOs that didn't even speak to each other. How can you run a company like that? And where was the board? Why were they not more aggressive about the leadership? Should they have hired another CEO? Would that have solved it? Not necessarily. But so when you come under those kind of pressures, your weaknesses become much more important and much more devastating.
And in fairness to the board, as you call out in the book, they were the ones, the board director was the one who called out the audit into the stock options as well. But
Yes.
eventually, because of increasing pressure, they break up this co-CEO era and the company's reinvented. Maybe we'll just say what happened at the very end and then where the company are now, because you do hint to a comeback at the end of the book in the epilogue.
Jim was the first to leave. He was done when the board decided to, I think, initially back Mike and then ultimately one of Mike's lieutenants to be the CEO, and he didn't last very long. They both became increasingly disenchanted with the company. The saddest moment I felt was when Mike left. He felt that the new CEO was taking the company in a direction that was wrong. It was time for him to leave. Mike Lazaridis left his job, left his office with his box of belongings. He drove to a local store and bought all the BlackBerries that they had to sell. And he put them in his box. And he said that he was afraid that there would never be any more BlackBerries. And he was going to get as many as he could because he felt it was over. And ultimately, he was right. It happened a lot more slower than he thought it would. But to me, it was one of the most poignant moments in their story that he did that.
And finally, Jackie, you mentioned about the staging for a comeback. And we see BlackBerry RIM are back. They're back in the game at the moment as well. But where was that for you when you wrote the book? Reminding our audience, it was 10 years ago. So where were things then? And then you can just look at the internet if you want to know where they are now.
I think 10 years ago, BlackBerry still thought it had a chance. It had a big investor, a very contrarian investor that bought them when things were really bad. And they hired in a new CEO, John Chen, who reduced the size of the company and turned its focus to the QNX technology. He saw great opportunity there. And the opportunity ultimately became computing within cars. He could see where the world was going. You could see where automakers were going. We see it in Tesla today. They're internal operating systems. And so they are still a small company, but they're growing and they're profitable. And they're very much invested in selling operating systems to automakers all over the world now. And they're creating an operating sort of a computer within the car that controls everything from music to other electronic parts. And it's still a small company. I don't know how much bigger it can get. You do think that over time, a much bigger player will want to come in and have either that technology or their customer base.
There's always assets in the ashes. And it's as we said before, and I loved, by the way, I was saying to Jackie, what you did on the cover is beautiful. It's a BlackBerry for those just listening to us, and it's like the death mask, the skull mask that you see in the celebrations of the death. It's a sad story, and it also shows you where you can come from with unbelievable drive and a willingness and hard work as well. But it's a brilliant piece of work and a brilliant movie as well. I really enjoyed the movie as well. And Jackie, very grateful for you for joining us.
And thank you very much. You brought back a lot of memories. This was a while ago. BlackBerry's still alive. It's still operating. Mike and Jim are in a very comfortable position. They moved on and done other things. And BlackBerry was a seminal moment in history that we were all part of.
And you've done a brilliant job. Really enjoyed it, along with your co-author, Sean Silcoff, author of Losing the Signal, the untold story behind the extraordinary rise and spectacular fall of BlackBerry. Jacquie McNish, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute. Kyndryl runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl and the Kyndryl Institute that features many of the guests and authors we've had on the show, from Paul Sangeet Chowdhury to Rita McGrath to Nadia Jeksenbayeva and many, many more at kyndryl.com/institute.